Thank you. Thank you. Hot dog and the land we belong to his brand. How you finally know? We're on the same journey and flying Oklahoma, Oklahoma, Oklahoma. Yay! Yay! Oh, boys, I'll tell you. Oh. Randy, can you hear me in the back?
You know, for a guy approaching his 100th birthday, you're remarkably spry, Mr. Oklahoma.
I'm just so glad to be here.
We're having to work out some technical problems, though, to amplify your voice.
You think we're on?
Is that on?
I don't know if we're on or not. Frankly, I hadn't been turned on in over 50 years.
And I did it.
Jennifer, you may want to undo whatever you did in his hand.
Honey, if you'd reach a little more to the left. All right. Can everybody hear that wants to? Joanne, can you hear this? Oh, good. I tell you, it's the Dickens growing old. I'm going to be 100 years old on November the 16th. You think I need to go to that?
Yes, sir.
Is that any better? Yeah. You know, my wife tells me that I don't need a microphone to be heard. She takes care of hearing me good. She says my sight's going, I can't see too good, I don't hear too good, and I don't smell too good. Gail, it's good to have you. Did anybody introduce Gail Derryberry? Good, good. I want you to know Larry's just fine. He got called away to the Supreme Court and asked me to sit in. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. Larry asked me to talk to you about my life. Now, Larry referred to me as Mr. Oklahoma. You can call me OK. But I want to tell you about how it came to be that I was born on November the 16th, 1907. So in a few months, I'll be celebrating my 100th birthday. And folks, I have had a grand and glorious 100 years. Thanks to people like you, the folks in the rural electric co-ops. How are you, Buck? Good to see you. You've made a great difference in the lives of the people of Oklahoma, of my boys and girls that have grown up here over the last 100 years. I want to compliment you for having some great officers. Like Larry Watkins, isn't he a dandy? He's kind of a modern day Will Rogers. You know, he's smart and he's good looking. Most of all, he can ride and rope. And that's what Will did pretty well, right, Larry? And that sweet Jennifer McCall. Jennifer, where are you? Yeah, that Jennifer got her finger in one of your light sockets. But she's sure a pretty girl. And Jennifer, thank you for helping me get here on time. I'm kind of like Santa Claus. Sometimes I just appear. And Harold Hale. By your applause, how many of you agree with me that Harold Hale is kind of the heart of the co-op program in Oklahoma? And Harold proves that being good looking is better than being smart. But to all of you, I want to say thank you. You know, the rural electrification program has changed my life. It changed my life. Back in the late 30s and the early 40s, when farmers were going to visit farmers and talking to them about this new Rural Electrification Administration program that was coming to Oklahoma, you know, I think there were three things that changed our lives as farmers and ranchers in Oklahoma more than anything. Number one was electricity. Because with electricity, our kids could read at night by lights other than kerosene lanterns. And they were smarter. And not just their homework, they were invited to read other books to become smarter. And they did. And most of those who did that are you. You grew up in those electrified homes so that you could read better. And we saved the eyesights of a lot of old men like me who didn't have to strain to those kerosene lights. So I think electricity was the one thing that we did to change our lives. Now the second thing that we did was mechanization. You know, it was something to go to tractors, farmhouse and John Deere's, instead of walking behind those old horses with those old one-row plows. We could ride, and we could farm more, and we could farm better. Mechanization's number 2. And I think the third thing that has changed the lives of rural Oklahoma is toilet paper. Well, because toilet paper saved the Montgomery Ward's catalog for the whole year. And as a kid, I hated it when it came Christmas time, and the only thing I could get was a widget, a xylophone, or a zebra. It just didn't seem right to me. The toys had already been used. Well, let me tell you, how many of you are from families that homesteaded in Oklahoma? Would you stand up? I got one here at the front. See, isn't this amazing? Isn't this amazing? Congratulations. You're the folks that made me what I am today. You're the ones that put the investment into your homes and into your families and into your work to make me live 100 years. And I'm telling you, I'm going to do at least 100 more if you'll keep working as hard as those folks did. Where is Hannah?
He's meeting with FEMA.
Pardon me?
He's meeting with FEMA folks.
Oh, he's meeting with FEMA. Well, I was just going to say, I'm not sure that in the long list of Oklahoma names, like Watkins and McCain and Smith and Hand, McCall, Etheridge, that there was a Viditapore. But he told me that Clarence and Daisy Viditapore were homesteaders here. So I'm going to give Hammond the benefit of the doubt. Let me tell you a little about myself. I was born on November the 16th, 1907 in Guthrie, Oklahoma. My mama was Indian Territory. My daddy was Oklahoma Territory. And they came together in Guthrie to get married and to have me. Now, the wedding vows were written by an old codger named Alfalfa Bill Murray. He called it a constitution. But it was a vow to all of those that were coming after him, that we were always going to be a great state. Now, these wedding vows, this Constitution was the longest one in the United States of America. Because Bill Murray had this hunch, actually it was a belief, that we couldn't trust big government, big railroads, and the big oil and gas company. He's probably right. He's probably right. So he wrote this long Constitution that gave us powers like the power of the initiative and the referendum so that we can write our own laws, and if we don't like what the legislature did, we can repeal theirs. Pretty smart. Bill was pretty smart, I'd say. But anyway, you'll read about all this if you pick up my baby book. You call it an Oklahoma history book, but it was my baby book, folks. And you'll learn about all these famous Oklahomans that made us what we are today. I need to tell you about my mama. My mama was Indian Territory, and that was a pretty tough part of this part of the United States. Is Stevie Bryan here? Steve's from over at Wilburton. Well, now over near Wilburton, and I'm not blaming Stevie for this, but over near Wilburton is Robbers Cave. Now, Robbers Cave was not named after those famous Americans like Ulysses S. Robert. Or Franklin Delano Robber? It was named after robbers. It was named after the James boys and the Daltons and Bell Star, the Doolins, those wild bandits that roamed eastern Oklahoma, who believed, just like Alfalfa Mill Bill Murray believed, that government, and particularly the banks, had too much of our money. And he tried to separate them. He didn't like the big trains, so he tried to take the bullion off of them every now and then. So we had these bandits over in eastern Oklahoma, and that's where my mama was born and raised. Western Oklahoma was a different matter. We had forts all over western Oklahoma. That's where that nice young Derryberry boy was born and raised. But we had Fort Sill and Fort Reno and Fort Towson and what else? Fort what? Fort Cobb. But anyway, we had forts out there because that was our government. Now, you remember the government of eastern Oklahoma? It was a man named Isaac C. Parker, the hanging judge. He was the justice for eastern Oklahoma, and he was a good one because he believed that pretty quickly you could convict somebody and then you could hang him. And hang him he did. The rich ranchers over there had those outhouses that had 2 holes or 3 holes. You know, us poor boys had 1 holer. This must have been a rich judge because he had gallows that had 2 or 3 holes in them. Trap doors that would drop down so he could snap the necks of the bandits in a moment. And I'll tell you, Robert, he did a better job than these yahoos in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. He knew what he was doing. Now, the law over in western Oklahoma Territory, where my daddy grew up, were the federal military folks. And they took care of the people there. They had a job of protecting the good Indians and the good whites. The problem was they didn't know who were good and who were bad. So people like George Custer made lots of mistakes, and he killed lots of innocent people and probably got his due at the Little Bighorn when the table was turned on him. But that was the law in western Oklahoma. And the people that lived out there started with the land rush. I want you all to remember forever and ever and ever the date April 22nd, 1889. April 22nd. I want you to write that down. That was the day of the big land run up near where you folks are from, Mike. Now, the April 22nd is important because that's also the birthday of Larry Derryberry. And getting him presents is always appropriate, so don't. But remember that April 22nd, because let me tell you what happened on that day. 50,000 people gathered at the border of the lands that were going to be opened to settlement. And at high noon, the soldiers who had patrolled the borders to be sure that nobody was getting ahead, although those blasted Sooners fooled us a little bit, waited till high noon and they fired their guns. And before the smoke had cleared, folks, people were rushing to heaven. The farms and the cities of western Oklahoma. They were trying to get 160 acres of land that they got by staking it and filing a claim. Or they wanted to get a lot in town where they could build a business. Or Doug Benz build a church. And they went off on foot and on bicycles, in carriages, in covered wagons, and a bunch of them piled onto the Santa Fe train that ran right down through the middle of that territory. They were hanging out the windows, they were hanging off the cow catchers, and periodically 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 would drop off and drive a stake right where that train slowed down. You're not going to believe it, but by nightfall, there was no unclaimed land in those territories. Now, they staked out cities. I want to tell you a little about the cities. They're not the kind of cities we have today, the kind that have grown up like Oklahoma City and Tulsa. And folks, I'm not sure that We've done the right thing growing in that direction, but we have. But the cities back then usually had a Baptist church on one end, a Methodist church on the other, and in between there was a livery stable, because for Pete's sake somebody had to take care of the horses. There was a mercantile store, because there had to be a place to at least to get some cloth to make shirts, pants, dresses for our boys and our girls who started on another lot at the schoolhouse. There was a general store where you could get your food and other supplies that you were going to need, particularly because a lot of my children lived a long way from those little towns. And they had a long way to go, and they needed to stock up when they got there. Now above, I guess the most popular place in town, to your surprise, was not the Baptist church. It was the saloon. It was the saloon. The saloon was popular with both the Baptists and the non-believer. So they could double up. They got 2 for 1 with the Baptists. And above it, above the saloon, there was a hotel usually, and you might find women of the night. You might find the bad girls. Now, when you saw James Arness and Kitty and saw those pretty girls, folks, that was a fantasy. That was a fantasy. They were ugly girls with lots of makeup. The pretty girls were married to the farmers, the ranchers. They were having babies. They were sweeping the dirt floors. They were trying to hold the lean-tos up and the dugouts down. Those were the pretty girls when I started my life back in 1907. Well, I went along pretty good. By the way, I had a nanny. I had a caregiver. His name was Charles Haskell. The baby book, the history book, says that he was the first governor of the state of Oklahoma. But he took care of me, buddy. He took care of me. He was an awful nice man, a good-looking man. Looked a little bit like Don Ellis from down in southwest Oklahoma. His job was to get the institutions spread across the state of Oklahoma. Now, you remember we already had the university at Norman. That's what it was, folks, whether you like it or not. It was the university. We had the land-grant college, Oklahoma A&M College, at Stillwater. And what we tried to do during my early years was to get other institutions out there. We needed to get mental hospitals, we needed to get prisons, and we needed to get teachers' colleges, because frankly, that was the #1 effort of the young people of Oklahoma who wanted to go on to college. It would be so they could be teachers one day. You might be interested to know that the senator from Granite, Oklahoma, had the first choice on the institution that he wanted in his hometown. And he had a choice between Southwestern State Teachers College and a reformatory. He picked the reformatory. He was convinced we were going to have more inmates than college students. So it was a good investment for Granite, Oklahoma. And the poor old senator from Stillwater got the leftovers. He got Southwestern State Teachers College, which is now a great institution in southwest Oklahoma. They got busy about changing things in Oklahoma. Because see, I started with nothing. I had nothing. And where I grew up was because people started contributing. It was like having a shower, a baby shower, and I had all of these things springing up around the state to make me a happy, bouncing boy. And we made it pretty good. There were 1.5 million people in my state at the time of statehood. By 1920, it had grown to 2 million people. Now, I don't know if you're Muslim or if you're Mormon, but that's a lot of kids for me to have. But I had them. I had them. And they were in all walks of life. 75% of my boys and girls were living in rural Oklahoma. They were people like you, who grew up, you worked hard, you took care of your family. And we rocked along pretty good until late in the teens, when the Great War came along. We refer to it now as World War I. But back then, we never dreamed there'd be a World War II. We just called it the Great War. Not great because it was wonderful, great because it was big and important. And when the call came out for able-bodied men to go to the aid of those who needed to fight for freedom, 91,000 of my boys answered the call. Now, there were 1,000 of them that were killed in action. There were 500 missing in action. There were 700 that died of disease. I don't know if you remember the Spanish influenza that you've read about in my baby book, but it swept across Europe and into the United States. It killed 700 of our boys. So we were struggling through that as we got into the 1920s. And we had fought that great war, and we were moving along. We got down near the end of the 1920s, and lo and behold, on October the 29th, 1929, the big Walmart, the big stock market crash occurred in New York. We had bankers at the top of those tall buildings that were jumping out. They were killing themselves because they had lost their money, and maybe more important, the money of others. I always thought it's good eyes from Oklahoma, because I don't think you could hurt yourself jumping out of a dugout or a lean-to. So we saved a lot of lives. But let me tell you, we took a blow to the belly, because when the stock market crashed, price of your crops crashed too. And there's a struggle, the likes of which you've never seen. We had over 90,000 people on the welfare rolls. That didn't mean they were getting money. It meant they were getting something. May have been a little food, maybe a few dollars. We had soup kitchens in Norman and Oklahoma City and Tulsa that reached as far as the eye could see. We were having bad days in Oklahoma. And just as we thought things might get better, we got into the 1930s, and let me tell you what happened. In the early 1930s, the winds started picking up from the southwest. And God decided not to cry anymore on Oklahoma, and the rains stopped. Now, our conservation practices weren't real good back then. Some of you have changed the landscape of Oklahoma with conservation practices, but not back in the early 30s. And the dust blew. In 1935, we had what they called Black Sunday, where the dirt was so thick and the dust was flying, and the sun was covered like an eclipse. And you couldn't see 1 foot in front of the other, because it was black as night. And those hundreds of thousands of acres of topsoil blowing from Texas to Oklahoma and then taking ours on up to Kansas. By the end of the Dust Bowl, 100 million acres of land had been stripped of its topsoil. In Oklahoma, the little kids had to put on masks to go to school. Farmers had to put bandanas around their faces to keep from eating mud all day as their spit got mixed in with the dirt. The lawyers were the lucky ones. They just kept wearing their bandit masks. But folks, it was a hard time. Well, in 1937, God smiled again on Oklahoma, and the rains came. And a year later, you could drive out in western Oklahoma, and you could see those beautiful hills covered with yellow, golden, waving wheat fields. And we were back. The farmers and ranchers were back. Now, we had elected a guy named Roosevelt. I think Derryberry calls him Roosevelt. What does he know? Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president. Alfalfa Bill Murray, that character that wrote my mom and daddy's wedding vows, he became governor. He became my nanny in 1930. And he did a lot for us folks while FDR was doing things nationally. And we had Oklahomans work themselves out of poverty. Well, we proceeded on through the problems with the Depression. We were ready to smile again when one day, December the 7th, 1941, you'll never believe what happened. A bunch of planes piloted by the Japs. Wait a minute. I can't use that word anymore, Larry. I think that's politically incorrect. And I've had to really watch myself, by the way. You can't call them that word anymore. And you know we can't call the African Americans the N-word anymore. And we can't call the Hispanic Americans the S-word anymore. And we can't call the people that went to the University of Oklahoma the SOB words anymore. So we've changed a lot in getting politically correct. But those Japanese went into that little old sleepy harbor in Hawaii and they dropped bombs, and folks, they caught us off guard. And that was the start of the Second Great War, World War II. Now, we had had 91,000 people that went to World War I. I bet you'd flunk a quiz if I asked you how many we had in World War II. We had 197,000 volunteers to go fight for freedom for this country and those countries in Europe. We had another 300,000 that were drafted. See, if it wasn't in my baby book, I wouldn't believe it either. But we had nearly 500,000 boys and girls doing battle. Over 6,000 of them were killed. Over 11,000 were wounded. But when they came back home after that glorious victory, the people of Oklahoma and America opened their arms to them. We had parades. We had parades where the veterans could walk down the street. It was one of our proudest moments. But what it did, you remember, it dumped a lot of folks back into the workforce. Thank goodness for the GI Bill, because some of you probably took advantage of that. And you young folks, isn't this getting old, the dickens? Isn't it the dickens? Did you know that the older I get, the more problems I have? I've even started peeing in Morse code. It's dot, 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 dash, dash, dot, dot, dot. It's a dickens, but I guess we ought to keep trying to get older, shouldn't we? Well, let me tell you what else happened in the 40s. I happened to inherit a couple of pretty good nannies in the 1940s. In 1942, Robert S. Kerr was elected as my nanny, governor of the state of Oklahoma. He probably did more than anybody to change us from a little colloquial state that was kind of hunkered down, hoping nothing else bad would happen. But after the World War I and the Dust Bowl and the Depression and World War II, for Pete's sake, we had a right to hunker down. But he said we got to be part of the national scene. So he turned us into more of a business state that had relationships with the federal government. And then Robert S. Kerr was followed by Roy J. Turner. I don't know that he was such a great governor. He certainly was a good governor. But he raised cattle. And I give him credit for helping to instill some pride in the ranching folks here. Right, James? What do you have, Hereford cattle? Oh, there were there were thousands of acres of land with Roy J. Turner's cattle on them. I don't know where he got the money for them. I guess it doesn't matter. 50 years later, the statute of limitations is run. But he did a pretty good job, too. And then we got into the 1950s. I hope I'm not boring you folks with this history. I want to tell you about the 1950s because it was an interesting time. Unfortunately, we started off the 1950s with another war, the Korean War. You know, they called it a police action that was sponsored by the United Nations. But for those boys that had on uniforms that were taking bullets, it was our war. And we believed that we were fighting for truth and justice and the American way of life. And Mr. Oklahoma believes that's true today. Now, we had some good nannies during the 50s. In 1954, Raymond Gary was elected governor. 1958, J. Howard Edmondson. And you talk about two birds that couldn't have been any different. Gary and Edmondson were those two birds. Raymond Gary was Mr. Baptist. And by the way, my old friend Robert S. Kerr, who was also a big Baptist, you remember, well, Robert S. Kerr would occasionally take a drink of whiskey. And he'd occasionally play a little gin rummy for a penny a point in the parlors around Washington, D.C. Not Raymond Gary. He was one of those no-nonsense Baptists. And even when he died, he gave acres and acres of land and property for the Baptist children to have a decent place to live. That's the kind of guy he was. But I'll tell you what I liked about Raymond Gary, why he makes me proud. Raymond Gary was here when Brown versus Board of Education was decided by the United States Supreme Court. You may remember that's the decision where the Supreme Court said that having schools for blacks and schools for white that were equal but separate, that's the game we had played in Oklahoma for 50 years, and the Supreme Court said if they're separated, they can't be equal. Now, at the time Raymond Gary was governor and this decision was handed down, Orville Faubus over in Arkansas stood in the schoolhouse door and wouldn't let a little black baby into that school. And George Wallace was over in Alabama and he wouldn't let those little black boys and girls enter school there. Let me tell you what my friend Raymond Gary said. He said, we are going to follow the law of the land. And he called the superintendent of public instruction over and the chancellor of higher education, and he said, folks, we're going to integrate our schools. And I know by 1978, the black schools that were usually called Lincoln or Booker T. Washington were closed. And black babies and white babies and Mexican babies and Indian babies were going to school again. And we're better people because of Raymond Gary. Now, Howard Edmondson was a bird of a different color, folks. This guy had hair that was as red as Jennifer McCall's. And he was as wild as Jennifer McCall, let me tell you. This guy came in a blazing prairie fire. He was intent on changing Oklahoma, and he did it. Tell you what, a couple of things are that Howard Edmondson did. First of all, he ruined the Democratic Party. Never forgive him for that. The reason he ruined the Democratic Party is because the Democrats had figured out that the people who control all the position in state government are the best campaign force the Democrats can ever have. So they wanted to be sure they had campaigners working in state government. Now, it doesn't mean that we got a lot of good work done. No, no, no. But we got a lot of good Democratic politics taken care of. Jennifer, get back here. You're no better than the rest of us. But the second thing that Howard Edmondson did was to initiate, for a vote of the people, the repeal of prohibition. Wasn't easy. In fact, on Statehood Day, I need to tell you, the day that my mom and daddy got married in Guthrie, there was a law, part of this Statehood Act, that said at midnight on November the 16th, 1907, there shall be no legal alcohol beverages in Oklahoma. And there was a heck of a dilemma. They had to either ship out, box up and ship out all the whiskey, or they had to drink it. What do you reckon they did? Sure, they drank it. And they had a wonderful celebration. They didn't remember much of it the next day. But from that day till 1979, we had prohibition. Will Rogers was once asked, when are the folks in Oklahoma going to do away with prohibition? Will Rogers said, well, it won't happen as long as the Baptists stagger to the polls to vote no. Well, in 1959, they staggered to the poll and voted yes. And we repealed prohibition. Now, it wasn't. It was a little peant kind of law, because they didn't just open it up so you can order liquor by the drink, which George Hand and Doug Benz liked. They had liquor stores and liquor bottle clubs. It wasn't liquor by the drink, it was liquor by the wink. The bootleggers never had it better than they had it after the repeal of prohibition, because folks liked home delivery. And those folks would deliver. A little higher, but it was worth it. It was worth it. And it was pretty good whiskey. So Howard Edmondson changed us a lot. Let me tell you about the 1960s. That Derryberry boy came into the legislature in 1963. But he came in on a year that lightning struck Oklahoma. Lightning in the name of Henry Bellman. In 1962, this cantankerous old farmer rancher from Billings, Oklahoma, who had problems staying awake during the day, loved buttermilk. By the way, at the inaugural ball, he served buttermilk instead of whiskey. I went to the Skirvin Hotel. But Henry Bellman was the first Republican to hold the office of governor. He became a Republican nanny to me. He often said, and I think this was his hallmark, I'm not real smart, I don't have a very good memory, so I have to tell the truth. Not bad, huh? And Henry Bellman did just that. Well, then we got into the 70s, and that was an exciting time. The 70s were a wonderful, energetic time. We were getting ready to gear up our oil and gas production. In 1970, we elected about 10 state officers. Let me recount a few of them. David Hall. He went to the federal pen. State Treasurer Leo Winter. He was indicted for corruption. Little John Rogers, Secretary of State. He was impeached. Big John Rogers was a state auditor and inspector. He left office with a plea bargain not to put him in the penitentiary. And Wilbur Wright was elected labor commissioner, and Wilbur just had this penchant to drive and to charge mileage even on days that he didn't drive. In one of those horrible ice storms one day, he drove over 1,000 miles. David Hall wanted to give him a medal, and I wanted to fire him. By the way, that young Derryberry boy was the bright light that shined when he was elected Attorney General that year. So I don't want you to forget that while you're at it. But the 70s were an important time. We elected a young man named David Boren. I remember the day that David Boren and Larry Derryberry were on the podium together in downtown Oklahoma City. And I introduced him. And I said to the crowd after bragging on him, and he deserved to be bragged on. You remember he came in with a broom, sweep clean state government, and he did. Well, I introduced him. And I said, this is a man that's a Rhodes Scholar, and he graduated from undergraduate work and from college, magna cum laude. And I said, I graduated from the University of Oklahoma. Thank the Lottie. But he was a fine boy. He was a fine boy, and this issue with corruption went away. He shortened the ballot, and folks, he started changing the face of education in Oklahoma. He was a great contributor. Now, tragedy happened in 1974. No, I'm sorry, 1978. We had two fine candidates for governor, George Nye and that Derryberry boy. And George Nye really put a knot on his head. And I heard Larry say one time that he got out of politics because of illness and fatigue. The people got sick and tired of it. But it's the best thing, Gail, that ever happened to me. Would you agree? I got to get to know my little babies again. Well, the Derryberry boy, I'm sorry. Got to know his babies again. And we ushered in a new time with George Nye, who's one of the brightest, cleverest, funniest guys that we've ever known. The oil and gas industry was humming. He could do no wrong. There was money in the coffers that you couldn't spend. And that was the case until about 1982, when the Quail Creek Bank came tumbling down. Quail Creek Bank here in Oklahoma City. Larry, you tell me when it's time for me to quit, because I may go on here longer than you need or you want. The Quail Creek Bank folded. A man named Beat Jennings was the president. A little old bank with like $4 million in deposit, started making oil and gas loans. Didn't have enough money to do it, so they started farming out those loans to banks in Seattle and Chicago, and at the end of the day, they were phony, bogus loans. In fact, it was said that there were 10,000 people in the oil and gas business at that time. 500 of them were looking for oil and gas. 9,500 were looking for investors. Right? Well, it didn't work out so well. When those bank loans failed, it took, when Quail Creek Bank went down, it took down the bank in Seattle and Chicago and banks all around the country, including Oklahoma. And George Nye got what Larry Derryberry thought he deserved. A bankrupt state. George Nye did a great job. He finished his work, and then we went on to some other really good people who served as my nannies after George Nye. It's hard to believe that Henry Bellman made a comeback. Can't believe it. But that guy, who was formerly chairman of the Republican Party, the first Republican governor, a Republican United States senator who showed courage that was matched by very few, became the first Oklahoman to be elected governor twice. But there was about 20 years between them. And then we had David Walters. David Walters never met a contributor he didn't like. Now, Tom, he was the first Western Oklahoma governor. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that. The next one was Frank Keating. It's good that he had that big grin because he kept his foot in his mouth during his 8 years as governor. But those two boys put in a lot of time on education. And we saw education budgets increase 30% during the time that they were there. And then that brings us on up to Brad Henry, that fine young boy that seems to be doing everything right. Oh, by the way, back when the Penn Square Bank collapsed, happened because the oil and gas industry collapsed. And that's what took our money out of our treasury. And we saw t-shirts in Oklahoma City and Tulsa that were worn by people who had been involved in the oil and gas industry and who hadn't. And it said, "Dear Lord, if you'll give us another boom, this time we won't pitch it away." except they didn't use the word pitch. You fill in the blank. Lo and behold, we've had another boom. Lo and behold, we've had another boom. And things are going pretty good. Now, during the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, you folks have been right there with me. You've been carrying out your duties as rural electric cooperative officials. You've done a great job. I want to tell you about just a few of my favorite boys. I guess I have to start with a man named George Guest, Sequoia. He never lived in Oklahoma. In fact, he came to Oklahoma in 1828, 80 years before I was born. But he's important to Oklahoma because he invented the Cherokee alphabet and introduced education and culture into the Cherokee community. He came up with over 70 sounds that he put symbols for. And he made his alphabet. And the kids could learn to read and to write. And frankly, the Cherokees were usually better educated than the settlers that came into Oklahoma back during those early days, thanks to Sequoia. And did you know that the doctor wanted to name me Sequoia instead of Oklahoma? And somebody prevailed, took Oklahoma, home of the red people, and that became a name. And by the way, I'm proud of that because I'm proud of the Indian heritage that we have there. But thanks to George Guest, thanks to Sequoia, we got things off and running. You may remember that over in eastern Oklahoma during pre-statehood, we had those 5 civilized tribes, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, Seminole, and Creeks. And down toward the end, we had Plains Indians in western Oklahoma, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Apache, Comanche, Kiowas, and those folks. We got a proud Indian tradition. Next, I'd have to tell you that one of my favorites is Alfalfa Bill Murray. Cantankerous old coot, but one of the smartest guys I ever knew. He wrote the Constitution. He was president of the Constitution. He was Speaker of the House of Representatives. He spent 2 terms in the United States Congress. In 1930, he helped bail us out of the Depression as governor of the state of Oklahoma. I don't think I'd want him to spend the night with me, but I was glad that he was here to produce the kind of people I see before me today. I have to mention Robert S. Kerr. Robert S. Kerr was a great governor, even a greater United States senator. He was called the uncrowned king of the Senate. Most of you have heard one of the comments he made, which is, I'm against anything I ain't in on. He was in on a lot. He did that darn McClellan-Kerr waterway. Don Proctor, where's Don Proctor? Don, if we had put dams on Stinking Creek and Turkey Creek, we could have floated all the way to New Orleans down in southwest Oklahoma. But Kerr started that. That's an idea of the kind of vision that he had. Then I'm going to mention Henry Bellman. I've told you a lot about Henry, but he took us to a 2-party state. He was honest and honorable, hardworking, and he made a difference in the way we take care of business today. But my favorite son, my very favorite son, was Will Rogers. Will Rogers was there during the Depression, and he was there during the Dust Bowl, and he was there during World War II. He was there when we needed a smile. He was a movie star, and he was a vaudeville performer. He made fun of presidents and kings. He was a roper. He was a rider. He was an all-around boy, and somebody that created an image for Oklahoma that perhaps all the millions of people that have lived here since have tried to create and just can't capture the spirit of Will Rogers. He's my favorite. Well, let me say thank you to you boys. You've got bigger things to do. Thank you for lighting up my life during the last 70 years. And in closing, let me tell you, you keep the lights on for me. You hear? Thank you.